There are few games that are seen as gigantic cultural milestones of not just a genre, but the medium as a whole, and I can safely say that when Arkham Asylum released 14 years ago, it quickly cemented itself as one of these games. It was immediately evident to everybody that Arkham Asylum was not like the other girls. It wasn't a shitty, buggy cash grab like most comic book games, at least that was a perception in 2009. Fucking Superman 64 was barely 10 years old at that point, so can you really blame them? Even after all the other Batman games that have released since 2009, this was, and still is, an incredibly polished game that taps into a side of the character that not many other games do. So much so that it's still well worth playing, regardless of if you've only played the newer games, or even for more casual fans of the character who don't really give a fuck about, I don't know, Calendar Man. And the thing that's so interesting about Asylum is that this great game was only made in about 2 years, which is very short even for the time. In most cases, a short dev cycle is a fucking death sentence, but here I think that short amount of time was used to the team's advantage since it allowed them to trim all the fat that you'd expect with AAA games. Even for the time, they may not have had live service games or battle royales every other week, but there were still hefty expectations that came with the medium, like the growing amount of open world titles. So instead of having a full city to roam around, you can only explore the Asylum, which drives home the narrative of Batman being trapped in this prison with a bunch of criminals as he tries to stop the Joker. The story is also very short, the game's only about 5 to 6 or so hours. And even then, the story isn't very in-depth. Beyond a few character reveals like Dr. Young secretly working for the Joker, it's a very straightforward Batman story, but just told really well. Everything is very succinct, and the story has a lot of momentum, constantly pushing forward. Director Sefton Hill has gone on record stating how cutscenes were explicitly used to advance the story, meaning that all of the character motivations and important story development would occur in these very short pre-rendered cutscenes. The narrative is written by Paul Dini, who, let's say, has done his service for the Batman mythos and then some, from one of the main creative minds behind the animated series to a shit ton of comics. Dini's familiarization with a lot of these characters plays into how he was able to make almost concentrated versions of these characters to where, even if a villain gets very little screen time between cutscenes, boss fights, and audio logs, you're still able to get a very strong sense of who the character is. The audio logs especially were surprising since I never really usually listen to that stuff in games, and all of them here are very well written and very well acted to the point where some of them even made me uncomfortable in a good way. The most obvious one being the Riddler one where he mentions a baby. If you know, you know. Of course, you can't talk about a great story without mentioning the amazing voice cast behind it. Obviously, there's the Batman the Animated Series royalty, Mark Hamill as well as Kevin Conroy and Arlene Sorkin, may the both of them rest in peace, all return to reprise their roles as Joker, Batman, and Harley Quinn respectively. They all do a fantastic job as expected. Conroy is just the best Batman ever. There's also some voice acting royalty like Tom Kane as both Gordon and Quincy Sharp, or Fred Tastacore as Bane. There's even some more notable names who don't really get enough time in the limelight, like Kimberly Brooks as Batgirl and Tazia Valenza as Poison Ivy. Just an overall great cast that are able to really sell their roles, as well as get you invested in the world that Rocksteady has created here. However, arguably the most well-known part about this game and series as a whole is the combat, and despite having my reservations at first since it's been a very long time since I've replayed one of the Arkham games, it holds up. It's still really fucking fun. Regular hand-to-hand combat is a button masher where you spam attack and dodge or counter, and even occasionally do a ground finisher if you're able to do those because the animation takes a little bit. The higher your combo is, the more shit you're able to do, like throw a guy like he's just a fucking paperweight. That was my favorite thing to do in this game. You're also able to go into free flow where basically Batman starts flipping all over the room to keep the counter going. The stealth is simultaneously very simple, but also some of the best stealth I've seen outside of a full like fucking Metal Gear Solid game. You essentially just use gargoyles, gadgets, and grates to take down thugs without being spotted. Sometimes there's even an extra level of difficulty like the gargoyles being rigged to blow or a failstate for being seen. And those are a pretty fun change of pace for the most part. There's one near like the 65% mark of the game where you can't take down any of the enemies in the area until you take down the head honcho in the watch watchtower, and it's basically just an on-rails missions. That one was really dumb. Of course, there's some small quality of life changes that later games would introduce that I've kind of gotten used to. Specifically great takedowns and stealth, I really missed those this time around. But you can't criticize this game for not being able to see into the future. It's a very good foundation that got me to play all 4 games at least twice, so you're not gonna see me complaining about it at all. What I will say is that after Arkham Asylum, there were a lot of games whose combat was compared to this one, and I don't like that. I've mentioned in the past that that was the Dark Souls of late 2000s, early 2010s games journalism, and I stand by that fucking statement. And maybe that's why I didn't look at this game's combat fondly over time, which is unfair, but it was just so annoying to hear that fucking comparison all the time. That's not to say that there aren't games that take clear inspiration from this game's combat or just straight up copy and paste it. And I'd be lying if I said that Arkham Asylum didn't have a cultural impact outside of just comic book fans. But to say that any third-person action game's combat is just like Arkham is a fucking lie. Some of these games aren't even similar beyond just having a fucking counter button. I need to change the subject before I blow a fucking gasket. Arkham has some light Metroidvania elements where once you obtain a new gadget, it allows you to find new collectibles that were unavailable at first. You'll get the explosive gel, an upgraded bat claw, a hacking device, so on and so forth. Yeah, somehow Rocksteady was able to make a hacking minigame not entirely suck balls, so shouts out to them for that. Batman's constantly changing arsenal is how the game manages to keep the player on their toes, since Arkham is constantly changing. And that's what really sets this game apart from any other in the genre. Even from later Arkham installments, it's the world itself. The Asylum is a terrible fucking place, and despite being in a rated T game, it attempts to go as dark as it possibly can. There's a lot of great world building in this game, and most of it is done in the background. Like you'll see a fucking inmate with their eyes held open with metal bars like in the fucking Clockwork Orange. Or maybe you'll come across a couple thugs who brag about the Joker telling them to kill their sisters, but they don't have sisters, so they go out and find a random woman and run her over. Like, yeah, I get it, we've seen The Dark Knight, spooky Batman be doing shit, but like, it's still surprising. Of course, I can't not mention the Scarecrow stuff, which is some of the best parts of the game. Without getting too much into Arkham Knight, one of my biggest gripes with that game is the wasted potential of giving the Scarecrow center stage and having him play such a passive role in the end. But that, at the same time, adds to the spookiness of this game. I gotta find a new word. The gothic architecture, the music, the shadows, even the occasional jump scare, all make for a vibe that very few Batman media manages to play into. Alright, I promise this is the last time I bring up Arkham Knight. But even though that game initially seems like it's more fitting to talk about during this marathon since it's actually set during Halloween, save for one section during the end of the game, it doesn't really have a rich taste for horror that Asylum does. Asylum is also a game that is not afraid to be silent, which is something I always value. When you're outside of combat or any scripted sequence and just exploring the Asylum, there's no music. Which is more fitting for a game like this than always having a backing track no matter what's happening. It makes the Asylum more uncomfortable than it already is and allows you to take in the atmosphere. The fear that overwhelmed me during the Croc Lair sections was not during the points where he was running at me with the fucking OST blasting in my ears, but it's when he was underwater, unable to be seen, and all you could hear is your own footsteps. That's some good shit. The silence of Croc's lair, or the narrow, restricted first-person perspective in the visitor center, are small vignettes that add a palpable sense of discomfort that not many interpretations of Batman try to tackle at all. It's the cherry on top that makes this game work so fucking well. Even though it's short, it should get old seeing the same few hallways. However, between new enemy types, gadgets, and atmosphere, Asylum was always able to keep my attention. Although I will say that I will never 100% any of these fucking games solely due to the Riddler trophies. I would rather put spray deodorant on my eyes and blink every 5 seconds than do that shit. And while I'm on annoyances, I might as well bring up the big thing people dislike about this game, and that's the final battle with Titan Joker. I'm personally not bothered with the idea of Joker being a semi-mindless boss fight. Joker is somebody who rarely gets into physical fights, and I can see why that would bother some people, but I don't really mind changing it up a little. I also like Arkham Asylum's somewhat non-traditional approach, where boss battles can range from standard fights like Bane and Poison Ivy, to stealth sections like Scarecrow and Killer Croc. And the idea of giving the player the catharsis to beat the shit out of the Joker is satisfying. It's just kind of a shitty fight. It's nothing like the standard Titan enemies where you have to be wary of how fast and hard they hit, while also managing the standard thugs. Which is probably what Rocksteady were attempting to do to give Joker a sense of gravitas, much like Bane, who also varies from the standard Titan enemies, but here it just doesn't work. Everything is compartmentalized. You fight thugs, then you pull Joker down, then you hit him a few times, then you repeat the process only once because the third time you pull him down, you automatically win. It's a bad fight as is, let alone is the last thing the player sees before the game very abruptly ends. Then there's the post-credit scene that has one of 3 villains grabbing on a Titan container, be it Bane, Scarecrow, or Killer Croc. Whichever one you see is entirely picked at random, apparently. It's just kind of weird. Obviously, all of them are alive in later games, so they're kind of all canon in a way. Okay. Apparently, there was going to be a Wii version of Asylum, developed by none other than Red Fucking Fly Studio, who would go on to develop a different licensed game, TMNT Out of the Shadows, and even try to make that Darth Maul game that was cancelled. I'm so mad that this Wii port doesn't exist. Not because it would have been good, it would have been absolute dog piss. But I'm fascinated with weird console ports, and it would have been so much fun to talk about it in a YouTube video. Those with a keen eye might have noticed that my footage looks a little weird, and that's because I'm playing the Return to Arkham remaster from 2016, which had a decent amount of criticism when it was released for not running at 60 FPS, as well as a litany of graphical bugs. Personally, I didn't experience any of these issues, and the 30 frames per second, while ridiculous, was at least consistent. And I actually liked the graphical upgrades this time. I get that I criticize Life is Strange Remastered for a lot of the same things I will praise this remaster for, but I don't make the rules here, okay? The developer Virtuous did a great job of porting the original game and updating it for modern hardware. Also, shouts out to them for making that Joker DLC that was PS3 exclusive now available on all platforms with the remaster. Thank God. Apparently, they're also helping to develop the Snake Eater remake, so that's a fun fact that justifies me endlessly scrolling Wikipedia for hours for no fucking reason. I understand that City has some dodgier upgrades, to say the least. Hugo Strange does not look right at all. But maybe since Asylum doesn't have an open world or a wide variety of character models, Virtuous may have been able to focus more on making everything uniformly look pretty well. Usually I have an issue with remasters just bumping up shadows or adding bloom and calling it a fucking day, but since this is a game with a gothic horror atmosphere, the added shadows make a lot of sense. The Batsuit in this game is just one of my favorite character models ever now. It's hard to explain, it just looks right. As the game goes on, the suit gets more scratches and marks, Bruce even gets a 5 o'clock shadow, the cape begins to tear, it just all looks exactly how it should. I do wish some of the character models are updated to maybe look a little bit more like their appearances in Arkham City or Night. Specifically Poison Ivy and Harley Quinn. I never liked their faces. Something about their eyes makes me very fucking uncomfortable. Arkham Asylum is still a legendary game to this day, not because of the Batman IP, but because Rocksteady wanted to make a good game first and foremost. One that anybody can appreciate, and you can still feel that 14 years later. It went for a specific vibe and aspect of the character that's somewhat underrepresented, while also just being a solid fucking game. It is well worth playing, whether it be the original release, the Return to Arkham remaster, or even the upcoming Arkham Trilogy release on Switch that's apparently coming this December. Unless it gets delayed again. Alright, another Halloween video in the bag. Don't forget to share this to...